Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We'll have some additional people who continue to come in during the talk, but welcome to everybody. It's so nice to have you join us. This will be a very interesting presentation tonight. So you've made it to the Western Foundation's Conservation Seminar Series. And so on behalf of my team here at the museum, we hope that you've had as good an October as possible. I do want to, before we make the introduction tonight for our speaker, want to acknowledge that the Western Foundation in Camarillo, California, occupies the ancestral traditional lands of the Chumash people. We recognize the historic indigenous community in what is now called Ventura County, the indigenous peoples who live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homeland. In offering this land acknowledgement, we strive to affirm indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. The Western Foundation is a nonprofit natural history museum dedicated to the conservation and study of the world's wild bird species and to public education about them. We monitor birds on the Northern Channel Islands, in the Santa Monica Mountains, and along the Santa Clara River, and in Guatemala, and teach classes about the birds of Southern California and their conservation. Our bird collections are now open to the public by appointment through our webpage, which is www.wfvz.org. If you forget our website address, you can search for the Bird Museum, and through our updated now local name, which is officially the WFVZ Bird Museum and Research Center. Tonight we have a special guest who will speak on a very interesting and probably somewhat surprising subject, and that is the subject of James Bond. Jim Wright, our speaker, graduated from Syracuse University's Newhouse School of Communications and has written for newspapers and magazines in the US and Britain. He has published at least 6 beautifully illustrated and photographed nature books. I looked at some of them, they're magnificent, including ones about the famous Hawk Mountain of Pennsylvania, also the incredibly important Selva Maya rainforest of the Yucatan Peninsula, which is Central America's largest contiguous forest, and the New Jersey Meadowlands. He has written ebooks about bald eagles and red-shouldered hawks, and currently writes The Bird Watcher, which is a column for USA Today newspapers in New Jersey. And he also has a nature blog, which is very entertaining. I strongly suggest you look him up. Mr. Wright lives in Allendale, New Jersey with his wife, Patty. He served on the board of the Nature Conservancy in New Jersey for about a decade. He's currently leading efforts to get second-generation rat poisons banned in New Jersey, and is a deputy warden of his local marsh and a board member of the local library. This is a person who is committed to local action and as well as to being interested in global conservation issues. The book that Mr. Wright will speak about tonight was published in March 2020 and is on the subject of the real James Bond. In January of 2020, Jim contacted Renee and me about a Harpy Eagle egg in our collection that was collected by the real James Bond. And he mentioned that his book was coming out. I purchased a copy of the book later in 2020 and loved it. And given that our collection actually houses at least 60 egg sets of James Bond, I thought it would be great if Jim could speak about his new book. Jim will also refer to the need for increased conservation of Caribbean birds, which have always been threatened because they're restricted to small islands with many pressures, but now are even more vulnerable from the impacts of severe weather due to climate change. Jim is donating his speaker honorarium for tonight to the Nature Conservancy's Caribbean Island Conservation Programs. So please join me in welcoming our speaker on the subject of Caribbean birds and the real James Bond, Mr. Jim Wright.
Greetings, everybody. I'm going to share my screen here, and let's see. Have to hit a couple buttons and we'll be all set. Okay, I think we're in business here, I hope. First of all, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I'll be talking about the real James Bond, some rare birds, some rare eggs, and how James Bond got his name stolen.
Hold on one second,
Yep.
Jim, because there is a gray square that is on your screen. So let's make sure that we can, why don't you try
Great.
advancing to the next slide? Let's see if it'll go away. There you go, it's better.
Nah, you know what? Why don't we just, let me just close this. I'm going to jump out again if I
Okay.
can.
We'll try it one
And-
more time. I think we'll all love it, even if it has gray blocks on it.
Is that better?
That's better.
Okay, so
There you go. You got it.
so thank everyone for zooming in, and thank you, Linnea and Paul and Renee and the WFZ. I hope I get this right. WFVZ.
This
But
is
I
why
wish-
we changed our name.
I wish I could be there. I've looked your museum through the pictures. It looks awesome. I would be there tomorrow if I could be. It looks terrific. So I thought I'd start with a little about me. Like the real James Bond, I'm from Philadelphia. I'm part Scottish. I'm 6'2". Like the real James Bond, I go by Jim, not James. I like birds, and my middle name even begins with a B. So I think I was destined to write this book. By the way, you can see I'm from Western Philadelphia from that picture. So a little about the book. I wanted to mention first off that I love the cover, and I was thrilled as soon as I saw this cover designed by Mary Shields. Maybe some of you really top birders who would recognize that as a Cuban green woodpecker. And Mary actually got that off a postage stamp. And the tan stuff at the bottom is actually a map of the West Indies. So I thought this cover had it all. You can judge a book by its cover, and I think the book itself is pretty entertaining too. So it was a nice match. Inside the book, it is really nicely illustrated, and it's the kind of book when you pick it up, you go, wow, that feels good in my hands. But when I researched this for several years, I came across like an African postage stamp dedicated to the real James Bond. And there's an Ian Fleming book, For Your Eyes Only, which has a red-billed streamer tail on the cover, although many people don't notice that, as well as a wonderful story called, let's see, Goldfincher it was called, and it was a parody on the real James Bond if he were a spy. So also want to mention that I had an article in Smithsonian Magazine recently about who was the real James Bond. And if you go online, you can find that fairly easily. It was just earlier this month. This is the book that started it all. And this is going to be a dating tip for you as well. If you want to impress a date, bring Birds of the West Indies with you. I'm going to show you a scene from a biopic of Ian Fleming. And Ian Fleming, by the way, is played by Sean Connery's son. But if you look closely, you'll see what's up here.
Can I come in?
What time do you leave?
11 o'clock.
What's this?
Present.
Oh, Ian. How did you know?
I cut that off before it got too racy, but you can see the power of the Birds of the West Indies. This came up earlier this year. I found it kind of hurtful. Trivia Genius had a quiz. Who was James Bond named after? A real life spy, the creator's neighbor, an ornithologist, or a UK prime minister? And much to my chagrin, only 22% actually said that James Bond was an ornithologist. So hopefully by the end of tonight's talk, you will get the answer right. I will not quiz you, but keep it in mind. So who is the real James Bond? This guy? Daniel Craig in his the 25th 007 adventure this month. This guy, or the real deal. And that's a picture of the real James Bond of the 1960s at the Willow Grove Air Show in Pennsylvania. And they had the 007 car there, and his wife made him stand in front of it. I want to give you a taste of the book. And this is the scene of the crime where James Bond's identity was stolen. GoldenEye, which is where Ian Fleming spent his winters. So this is Raphael Corkill on talking about the introduction of my book. He's reading the introduction, and anyway, here goes. This is from the audiobook.
Introduction. A spy is born. The name of a man is a numbing blow from which he never recovers. Marshall McLuhan, Understanding Media. This is the story of the most notorious case of identity theft in history. Long before Ian Lancaster Fleming became a best-selling author, a single-minded Philadelphia ornithologist named James Bond wrote Birds of the West Indies, based on repeated expeditions to the Bahamas and the Caribbean from 1927 to 1935. The 480-page book, published in 1936, featured black and white line drawings of birds by noted artist Earl Poole. It quickly became the must-have book on the subject. Fast forward to early 1952. Fleming was starting to flesh out his maiden 007 novel, Casino Royale, and needed a name for his imaginary secret agent. As he would often do when inventing characters for his books, Fleming simply lifted a name from real life. He looked at the distinctive white dust jacket of Birds of the West Indies on his bookshelf, noted the author's name in capital letters, and took it. James Bond. Period. No middle name, not even a middle initial. Just 9 purloined letters. A spy was born.
So that gives you a taste of the book. Julie Zickafoos, who was an ornithologist herself, read an advanced copy and said, if the real James Bond does nothing more than convince readers that an ornithologist can be something other than proper, stodgy, or dull, it will have done a great service. And in this case, unfortunately, James Bond himself kind of reinforced that stodgy image. This is a picture of him with a bird he had found. And you can see he's wearing a bow tie and a suit, smoking a pipe, glasses, just the stereotypical kind of nerdy guy. And it was reminiscent of the Beverly Hillbillies with Miss Hathaway, and Wally Cox played one of her sidekicks, dressed wearing the binoculars and the whole shtick. So all us bird watchers and ornithologists for decades have been living down this image. Unfortunately, James Bond was kind of part of it. The thing that surprised me when I was researching this book was the backstory of James Bond. He grew up very, very rich, to say the least. His mother on the left there was a Roebling of the Brooklyn Bridge building Roebling. That's Jim to her far right there, and a brother Francis in the middle. And then on the far right is the father Francis, who belonged to, he was actually a founding partner of E.B. Smith, which later became Smith Barney, which made money the old-fashioned way they earned it. So they had tons of money, vacationed in Maine every summer, lived in a townhouse near Rittenhouse Square. When Bond was 4, his older sister had a ruptured appendix, I believe, in Maine, and her father rushed to her side, made it to Maine in 7 hours from Philadelphia back in 1904, and made it just in time, but it was a tragedy. She died the next morning, and I don't think the family ever got over it. To drown their sorrows, they built this huge mansion, 320-acre estate. It is now Gwynedd Mercy University, and the Bond house there in front of us is now the administration building, and it's walnut paneled. It is incredibly luxurious, and they moved there just to get away from the sadness. Unfortunately, Jim Bond's mother died shortly thereafter, and Bond's father remarried a woman from London, and for the wedding present, he gave her the mansion and then moved Jim and his older brother, Francis, to London. And Jim Bond, a Philadelphian, was educated at Harrow, and his name is carved in the wall there. You can see from the picture, a class picture, he was not very happy there, especially at first, where he was teased and got a lot of, you're a Yankee with a bad accent sort of jokes. And he was kind of bullied for a while. One of the things he really enjoyed in the summer was his uncle was a very famous artist named Carroll Sargent Tyson. And he's well known for his paintings and fine arts prints of Maine. He and James Bond did a series of 20 fine arts prints of the birds of Maine, including the snowy owl. And you can see these are spectacular. Snowy owls you can't even buy anymore, but they sell for over $10,000 a print at this point. Jim and his uncle also wrote The Birds of Mount Desert Island, which is the funniest bird guide I've ever read. I think it may have been his uncle's humor, but for crow, they say the common American crow is well known and widespread on Mount Desert Island, where it is jokingly referred to by some of the natives as soup meat. He also has instructions, if you want to see a tree swallow nest, go to some guy's post office, his mailbox on some rural route, and there'll be the swallows nesting in the mailbox. This is the most specific field guide I've ever seen, but it's absolutely charming. If you can get your hands on a copy, it is terrific. Bond's uncle, although he's a famous painter and actually has a painting in the White House collection, is better known for a painting he bought than a painting he painted. When he was in Europe one time, he had a lot of money and he decided he would buy Vincent van Gogh's Sunflowers. And when he got it home, he decided he didn't like it that much. So the family legend is that he put it behind his seat at the dining room table so he wouldn't have to look at it. The good news is that after he died, the family donated this painting to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and you can see it anytime you want. So this is Jim Bond. He goes to college. He went to Trinity College, Cambridge, and became a member of the Pitt Club there and majored in finance. And when he got home, he got a job with a bank, which is now a fancy restaurant, as banks tend to be these days. But he hated his job, and he realized he had a very small inheritance, but he realized if he invested it right and lived like a bum, he could do what he really wanted to do. And that was become an ornithologist with the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences. And that's the young Jim Bond with a tray of bird skins there. And he soon developed his calling in life, and that was to write about the birds of the West Indies. As you can see from that map there, that is a lot of islands and a lot of water. And James Bond got deathly seasick every time he traveled by water. So this was a real dedication on his part to become an ornithologist in the West Indies. He often traveled by mail ship because it was sort of like one of those city buses where you can get on and get off whenever you want. And so he would get on a mail ship, hang out for 3 weeks or a month on one of the small islands and wait for the next mail ship to come by, hop a ride to the next island. And that's how he went about it for almost a decade. When he got ashore, this is a picture of the Zapata Swamp where some very famous birds were discovered. He lived in a charcoal burner's hut and ate the local rodents, just like the local natives did. So he kind of roughed it, and that's the way he liked it. He wasn't in one of these big expeditions like the Vanderbilt expedition, or even what Bond's father would go on. He was pretty much a loner. The tools of his trade, this was a nice surprise when I researched the book. In the archives of the Academy of Natural Sciences, they bring out Jim Bond's pocket knife, and they pull out a blade and it says "for flesh only." And it just sounds like some sort of Ian Fleming short story. So, but James Bond actually had a penknife engraved "for flesh only." He also used arsenic. You guys probably know this, but used it to kill the little bugs on the bird skins. And he caught the birds mostly with a double-barreled shotgun. So he's in all these islands for 10 years straight, on and off. And he decides he's going to publish his life's work, Birds of the West Indies. He goes to Joe Lippincott, the biggest Philadelphia publisher. And Lippincott says, "Sorry, this is something for the museums, not for a publisher." Turns out that Joe Lippincott was incredibly wrong. The book in its various editions stayed in print from 1936 to like 2006, more than 6 decades. And there's so many versions of it, and some of them are real collectible items. And of course, part of it is because of that 007 James Bond connection. But I came across his interview with Ian Fleming, and he will explain how he stole the identity.
Mr. Fleming, how does an author tackle the problem of selecting a name for the hero of his stories?
Well, it isn't only the hero. I mean, I generally pick up names just driving through the countryside, through villages and so on. You'll see an interesting name over a tobacconist or chemist or something of that sort in any country in the world. But when I started to write these books in 1952, I wanted to find a name which wouldn't have any of this romantic overtones like Peregrine Carruthers or whatever it might be. I wanted a really flat, quiet name. And one of my Bibles out here is James Bond's Birds of the West Indies, which is a very famous ornithological book indeed. And I thought, well, now, James Bond, now that's a pretty quiet name. And so I simply stole it and used it.
The trouble is, Fleming stole the name in 1952, but never told Jim Bond or his wife he was doing this. And of course, he didn't know that 007 and James Bond were going to become household names. But in the early 1960s, Bond and his wife started getting late night calls from breathless young females going, "Hello, could I speak to James, please?" And Mary and Jim Bond are going, "What is going on here? Something has happened. We need to find out what." And a friend wrote to Mary Bond and said, "By the way, I read an interview with Ian Fleming in Rogue magazine, and he says he stole your husband's name for his secret agent." So Mary wrote to Ian Fleming, accused him basically of stealing her husband's identity. And Fleming wrote back, confessed to the crime, and said, "If you're ever in Jamaica, please stop by and see me." So in 1964, Mary Bond convinces her husband to go up and talk to Ian Fleming, and they drop in unexpectedly. The first thing Ian Fleming says is, "You're not here to sue me, are you?" And Bond replied, "No, I don't even like your books." And Fleming said, "That's perfectly understandable. Come on in, let's have a drink," whatever. They had a great day. And at the end of the day, Fleming got out a copy of You Only Live Twice and signed it to the real James Bond from the thief of his identity, Ian Fleming, February 5th, 1964, a great day. So just as Ian Fleming stole James Bond's name, I thought I'd steal that inscription for the title of my book. So here's a picture of James Bond. He found an extinct Eskimo curlew that had been shot by a hunter in Barbados. And someone thought it was a rare bird, gave it to him, and he realized this was the last known Eskimo curlew. It had been extinct for over a decade, yet here this one popped up. Typically, when Bond would make a discovery like this, it would be in ornithological texts or Scientific American. But since Jim Bond was now James Bond 007, this discovery made headlines all across the country, and headline writers had a blast with it. But you can imagine Jim Bond, who is a pretty well-known author and well-known ornithologist, suddenly is the butt of all these jokes. Gets on airplanes and asks him where he's hiding his gun. How does he like his martini? He got pretty sick of the James Bond connection after a while. The James Bond connection really got worse after he died. Bond died in 1989, lived most of the 20th century. But in 2002, Pierce Brosnan was in a movie called Die Another Day. And here he is walking into a Cuban hotel, carrying a copy of Birds of the West Indies by, I guess, himself. And I think I'll show you a little. This is the scene that really iced the connection between the ornithologist and his spy. I think this won the award for cheesiest dialogue.
Magnificent view.
It is, isn't it? Too bad it's lost on everybody else.
Mojito? You should try it.
Jacinta Johnson. Our friends call me Jinx.
My friends call me James Bond. Jinx, you say?
Born on Friday the 13th.
You believe in bad luck?
Let's just say my relationships don't seem to last.
I know the feeling. The predators usually appear at sunset.
And why is that?
It's when their prey comes out to drink. Too strong for you?
I can learn to like it, if I have the time.
How much time have you got?
Until dawn. What about you?
Oh, I'm just here for the birds. Ornithologist.
So I apologize for that. That's some of the worst dialogue I've ever heard. But anyway, that cemented the ornithology connection. It continues to get worse. This is Null Null Duck, a German comic book from Disney. I think James Bond would be rolling over in his grave if he saw some of this stuff. That is actually James Bond's grave in suburban Philadelphia. So getting lost in all this is Bond was quite a conservationist. And I wish I'd written a little more about it in my book, but he was an amazing guy. He collected some amazing critters for science. These are just some of the ones at the Academy of Natural Sciences. You can see the Cuban trogon and the streamer tails there. Just some amazing birds, and they are fairly significant to this day. I just wanted to highlight one, the Bahama nuthatch. This bird Bond discovered by bumming a ride on a rum runner to an isolated part of Grand Bahama Island. He notices this nuthatch there doesn't look quite like the brown-headed nuthatch of the southeastern United States and collects two of them. And goes back, and it's always been a subspecies, of the nuthatch. And recently, the Ornithological Association has declared that the Bahama nuthatch is a distinct species, and at the same time, because of the hurricanes that hit the Bahamas, it is an extinct species. And two of the real key study skins to learn about this bird are the two skins, including the one on the left there, that Bond collected way back in like 1926. And so what is the significance of that study skin? I asked Jason Weckstein of the Academy of Natural Sciences, and he said, prior to the last bout of hurricanes, there were only a handful of individuals detected. Either way, the Bahama nuthatch is on the brink of extinction at least. It's hard to prove extinction, as we have seen with the continued push to find the ivory-billed woodpecker, but that makes the two study skins that Bond collected even more significant. Says Weckstein, They are the only things we have to go back to with regard to extinct and in many cases highly endangered species such as this. This may be the only way we learn from our mistakes. So Bond also collected some incredible bird eggs, as Linnea mentioned, 60 sets in all. And one of the ones that really got my attention was the Harpy Eagle eggs collected in the spring of 1926. And I've done some research on the eggs, and turns out that they were found in northeastern Brazil in 1926 in a mahogany tree. It was the lowest branch, 110 feet off the ground, and they hired a guide to get the eggs. And Bond points out that climbing the tree was most strenuous and dangerous, which I guess it would be if it's the lowest branch is 110 feet up. What I noticed, and Bond reinforces, is they collected the eggs 2 weeks apart, so the poor guy had to climb the tree twice. And here's a map. It shows you it was the headwaters of the Rio Hanganapi River, and you can actually track this down. And all these specimens that Bond and all these other ornithologists collected are still very valuable today. The one thing I found fascinating was that Bond noted that both, but especially the second egg, are badly nest stained. And when I saw these eggs, I wondered how they got so stained. And I figured it must have been somewhere in their 95-year history, someone spilled coffee on them or something. But that's pretty much the way they came out of the nest. So I asked Linnea, why, what's so important about eggs like these Harpy Eagle eggs? And I'm going to quote her now. I hope that's okay. But she says that eggs in a collection can be studied in myriad ways and provide vital information useful for the conservation of species. For example, this historic Harpy Eagle egg can be measured for its length, breadth, and shell thickness. And these can provide a baseline for comparison with field measurements taken on modern eggs to see if modern eggs have significantly changed in size or shell characteristics. Recent changes can indicate issues with breeding or pollution contamination, such as was seen with DDT impacts. This is an egg of a Caribbean broad-winged hawk collected by James Bond on St. Vincent. It fascinates me. I know in the Northeast here, we see, if we're lucky, thousands of broad-winged hawks migrate every year. And I'd love to see a comparison of like a piece of that egg and do some DNA on that and find out what it's like compared to the broad-winged hawks of today. Linnea says the eggs James Bond collected between 1927 and 1930 represent an extremely valuable record of the breeding of birds from many islands in the West Indies: Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Jamaica, Cayman Islands, Bahamas, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. And this is why egg sets matter. This is a greater Antillean Elena egg collected by James Bond in Haiti in 1930, now considered a threatened species. And what's happening in Haiti is so alarming now. I worry for the birds down there, and all these bird skins and eggs that have been saved are invaluable to science. As Linnea says, these specimens represent very important historic snapshots of what was occurring with birds on these islands at that time, and are crucial for providing baseline data on the species inhabiting the islands, their distributions on and among them, and basic biological information such as clutch sizes, egg colors, patterns, and laying dates. All these islands have experienced massive changes over the past 80 years since the eggs were collected, and thus we can now compare historic breeding details of birds with current patterns. And as Linnea says, thank you, James Bond. So a lot of what Bond wrote about in the introduction, the very first birds of the West Indies were ahead of their time. I'm not going to get into all of them, but just a few. One of the things he was worried about was the clear cutting of rainforests for plantations. He was extremely worried about the illegal parrot trade. He lobbied, he worked to get nature sanctuaries, national parks set up where birds could not be hunted anymore, and just railed against the wholesale killing of the birds of the West Indies by hunters. One thing I noticed on the birds of the West Indies, you can see the cover there. That is a Cuban tody. And if you look closely on the bottom left-hand corner, he actually has a nest hole for the bird on the cover of the book. And that is a true ornithologist to me, if they include the nest hole on the cover of the book. Similarly, on the second edition, he put the ivory-billed woodpecker on the back cover. And in that first edition, he said, there can be no doubt that the principal factor that has resulted in the extinction or rarity of so many West Indian birds is man. Bond wrote down, mentioned the perils of cutting down rainforests and the trafficking of rare wild parrots. He talks about the Luquillo National Park in Puerto Rico and what a great thing it was to stop the wholesale slaughter of birds. And then I came across this kind of parting clip here. See what you think.
The following day, I heard from my publishers that
That's Ian Fleming talking.
had got off to a rather good start. The rest is history. 12 books, isn't it? Can't think what my readers will do to me if I kill him off now. At the end of the day, he belongs here at GoldenEye. Don't you think?
Pat, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were making a film.
Can I help you?
Mr. Fleming,
Yeah?
the name's Bond. James Bond.
I've wanted to meet you all my life.
Same here. I see you have a copy of my book.
Indeed.
I don't suppose you'd be good enough to sign it for me, would you?
It is a pleasure. To have a pen. A pen? Thank you.
I just never have pen. Fame indeed.
From the thief who stole your identity.
Thank you, I'm most grateful.
Little corny there. So finally, the one legacy of James Bond is he brought us all here, some mostly remotely, to celebrate him, amazing birds, and some amazing bird eggs. So thanks for watching. My book blog is therealjamesbond.net and has some key links and info on how to order an inscribed copy. So I want to thank you all. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and maybe we can talk.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was very fun. Thank you. Hey, I know that there will be some questions, but I would like to start one off because I always have tons.
Great.
How long did it take you to do the research for your book? How long did it take you to write it? You know, how long were you working on it?
I'd say probably 3.5 years total. It started out as a column for my newspaper. I was looking for an idea, and the biggest problem was getting a New Jersey angle to the column. But the more I went down to the Academy of Natural Sciences and just realized this is a pretty interesting guy, the more I heard about how his family life was so, kind of disturbing and stuff, I really got to like the guy. And the more I learned, the better off it was. One of the great things was I got to go to GoldenEye a couple times, and I got to go to Cuba and the Bahamas and been to Mount Desert Island in Maine. And of course, I had a great excuse to go back to my hometown of Philadelphia. And James Bond's wife, Mary, was on the board of the Free Library of Philadelphia, and her archives are right across Logan Circle from the Academy of Natural Sciences. So I got to spend a lot of time in Philly, my hometown, and it was great.
That's very cool, because you've actually written quite a few books. You've done, some of them are photography based, but there's still the text that you had to write to accompany those, and they do take a while. So altogether, so the research and the writing was about 3.5 years.
Yeah, and I would start writing as I went. It wasn't like I did all the research and some things one thing led to another. One thing I never expected, I went to the local library and did an ancestry.com search on James Bond to see if there was like immigration records and ship records. And I found that James Bond had traveled to the West Indies on the SS America in May of 1941, which is the fastest, most luxurious ocean liner in the world. I'm going, why on earth would a cheapskate like James Bond travel on this really fancy luxury liner? Then I read about the Duquesne spy ring, the largest Nazi spy ring in US history. They had at least 2 and possibly 3 crew members, spies on board the ship with James Bond. So I wondered, well, maybe James Bond maybe he was a spy. And it's fun for speculation. And there are some people who swear that he was.
Oh, that's interesting.
I think his wife loved telling his story so much that she would have spilled the beans somewhere along the line.
All right, well, I have more questions, but let's see if anybody else does. Feel free to unmute yourself. I guess maybe I need to do that so that you all can unmute. And let's see, I'm just going to unmute you. And yeah, or raise your hand if you have. Okay, Laura, go ahead.
Oh, hi. Thanks so much for this presentation. It's really entertaining and informative. I'm wondering what method James Bond used to gather the skins. Do you know?
I would say there are a few methods. He used a shotgun with birdshot, I know, and I've read accounts of how he would get these birds. I think in some cases he bought, I hate to say this, it's kind of disillusioning, but I do think he bought some at the local market.
Oh, interesting. Because you said a double-barreled shotgun seems like it would just obliterate the bird.
Well, it's really fine powder birdshot, and that's how it's been done for many, many years.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right, anybody else with a question? Okay, Jackie.
Hey, thanks for such a great talk. I am actually a huge Daniel Craig Bond fan and a bird fan. So this
no.
I know.
Doesn't get any better.
Now I have to read. I have to read about the. I mean, I have a copy, an old copy of the Birds of the West Indies, and it's fantastic, as you were saying. I was going to ask 2 things. One's a really basic one. Speaking of taxonomy and names, are there any birds that are named after the real James Bond?
I think there are, and it is it's a Caribbean barn owl, and it's in the collection of the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, and it may be, instead of a lumper, it may be separated into its own species one of these days. Bond also, I don't want to brag because it's not me, but Bond does have a stink bug named after him as well. I've been trying to get the Academy of Natural Sciences because when Ian Fleming confessed to stealing his name, Fleming gave Bond the rights to use Fleming's name any way he wanted, including naming a wretched, horrible bug after him. So I think the Academy of Natural Sciences should take him up on that offer, you know. So we'll see. Maybe they'll do that someday.
The second question was about, I don't know if you said this, but of the islands that Bond went to, was there anyone in particular that you found like especially interesting, either ecologically or from the species diversity or from like a biogeography perspective, that he just thought was like the richest, like, you know, more ornithologists need to go and study it?
Well, Yeah, I went to Cuba, and so I'm a little in the Bahamas and Jamaica twice, but Cuba, I think, gave me a sense of what the islands were like during Bond's time, because Cuba still is, it's upside down and backwards, but there's no billboards everywhere. And, our bus was doing 70 miles an hour and they slammed on their brakes, and I don't know what's happening. And the bus driver who was stopping to avoid on a super highway, avoid hitting an ox that was crossing the road. And it's just that kind of place. And there's just lush forests, and it's just not as developed as we're used to seeing in the islands, or especially in America. So I like Cuba the best, and I hope to go back there one of these days.
Awesome.
But James Bond himself didn't necessarily single out one island over another that he absolutely adored.
No, I think he liked most of them. He seemed to go back to Haiti and Dominican Republic a lot. Certainly the Bahamas and Jamaica, of course. And can't go wrong with that.
Isn't there an episode in the book fairly late in his travels? He took Mary to the Isle of Pines off Cuba, and it seemed like that was of the trips they did together, that one seemed to be a one that sort of stood out in the book.
Yeah, that was Mary Bond's book, right?
Was that I read yours, and we have a copy of hers in the library here at the museum. So I read them both, and so the anecdotes from one and the other get kind of muddled up. But yeah, that may have been a chapter in her book. What I noticed relative to Jackie's question is he doesn't seem to have talked much about the islands that he particularly liked, but he would single out ones if they were particularly devoid of interesting things.
Yes,
he did that. After the fact, they'd say, well, what did you find anything? He said, no, there really wasn't much there to see. And seemed like if there weren't interesting new species, he kind of wrote them off.
I think that could be true. One of my favorite stories is when they thought the Bahama parrot was extinct, and he went to Nassau and talked to the doctor there, Dr. Dolly, I believe. And the guy says, don't bother, the Bahama parrot is extinct. But Bond bums a ride with some or other, gets off, and it's raining. He hides in a cave, gets up the next morning, and he's surrounded by Bahama parrots. So on his way back to Nassau, he just left a Bahama parrot feather in the guy's mailbox just to stick it to him. So had a pretty good sense of humor.
Randall, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. Your mic was off. Thank you again, Mr. Wright, and welcome to your friends at the West Coast. You did present a great intersectional story where spies and birds and writers all cross paths in the world. And so I was wondering about your path, your intersection of your love of birds and your love of story and writing. I love asking expert, high habits of mind folks, what was the moment, and a journalist approach, who, what, when, where, why? What was the moment or the trigger that connected you to journalism and birds? I see in your Smithsonian article that you won an award from your friends at the Audubon back east. So those two questions, what brought you to writing, what brought you to birds?
Well, writing, it sounds weird, but I started a neighborhood newspaper in the 3rd grade. So it's like,
oh, that's great.
It's frightening.
No, it's fantastic.
And then I kind of liked birds when I lived up in a small town in New York State, and there'd be red-tailed hawks, and I had a great blue heron in the backyard feeding in the stream. And I actually bought an Audubon print of a great blue heron and hung it up. And then I moved to a place called the Celery Farm in New Jersey, and it is a wonderful 107-acre natural area right in the middle of suburbia. And I saw some birds there, but the marsh warden at the time was a guy named Stiles Thomas. And he was this charismatic guy, a great teacher, and he just made me love birds. And he showed me, we have endangered red-shouldered hawks, and he would help me. He would have me help him take the wounded hawk to the Raptor Trust to heal it. So I was kind of led down the primrose path of birds from a master, Styles Thomas.
Thank you. That's a powerful story. Thank you. We make difference in people's lives. Thank you.
Yes.
And so did the same gentleman introduce you to the Bond movies?
No, my brother did. When I saw the first Bond movie, I was like, holy crow, this exists. It was From Russia with Love. And they had, belly dancers and all kinds of stuff that I had no idea. And I was 30 at the time. No, just kidding.
So
I was a youngster.
did you notice the slight, indication of ornithology, coming a little bit through the movies when you were watching them as a young person?
One of the great fun things of doing the book was I got to read all the Ian Fleming novels, and they're kind of trashy at points, but Ian Fleming, he loved birds. This was not a coincidence. He had Birds of the West Indies on his table. If you get a chance, read the short story For Your Eyes Only in the short story collection of the same name. The first 300 words of this spy story are about the red-billed streamer-tail hummingbird of Jamaica. And it is so beautiful. He won me there. And the other thing I found was Fleming, if he wanted to have a show someone who was a villain, he produced a very charismatic bird, then had the villain shoot it. Just to show his villainy without actually killing a human. But I don't want to give away, I hope I'm not giving away secrets here.
No,
but
that's
there's
great.
For Your Eyes Only, the bad guy machine guns one of the birds, and it's like, oh, please.
Yes, it's a good indicator.
Yes.
Keep your daughters away from people who machine gun innocent birds.
I've always said that. I told my daughter exactly that. She has a tattoo to that effect, actually. Just a reminder.
If they use other means, maybe it's all right, but not machine guns. They're overkill. All right. Does anybody else have another question?
Yeah, I'd like to speak. I'm a native of Philadelphia, graduate of Gwynedd Mercy College, 1960. And spent many fun times in the living room of the Bond home, now called Assumption Hall. And and guess where I live now? In Camarillo, California, the home of the Bird Museum.
Oh, wow.
That's great.
So I've been to the Bird Museum, but anyway.
Now you're rubbing it in. I have one Gwynedd Mercy University anecdote. And it showed how rich his parents were. I thought James Bond's parents were so rich. So Bond, when he became a famous ornithologist, was invited back with his wife to Gwynedd Mercy University. And they had tea with, I think it might have been a convent at that point, but they invited him back. He had tea with the nuns. And he said, this is the first time I've ever had anything to eat in the main dining room. When I was a child, I had to sit with my brother in a different room. He couldn't eat with the adults.
Oh, wow.
Really? It's a beautiful home.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. But I was sad when I heard couldn't eat dinner with his parents.
Yeah. When I was there in the 60s, it was at Gwynedd Mercy College, and it was all female and more, secretarial or nursing with it. But there were students who lived there, and I went up, and visited them in the rooms at that time. But they're not dorms. They've really grown and become co-ed and have a lot more buildings now. But anyway.
I went there and went birding one day. And
did you on the grounds? Beautiful.
Yes, it was great. one of the great
Yeah.
treats of writing books. You get to do stuff like that.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Anyway.
Was the real James Bond, was he, you have to remind me from the very beginning, was he interested in ornithology very early? Or is that something that came out later in his life?
I think it really came out, his father went on an expedition to Brazil, I believe, or Uruguay, and that kind of was a big deal. And then his uncle and painting the birds.
Paintings.
Yeah.
But the boy actually did go bird watch a little bit as a young
Oh yeah, I think he did, absolutely. And I don't know if I mentioned it, but the birds in those fine art prints, James Bond was basically Audubon there. He shot the birds that his uncle painted.
Ah, I understand. I understand. Well, that is the original source of most materials in collections. You know, hand collecting or banding, you know, netting or something like that. So yeah, that's a legacy that's there, and Bond was part of that whole process.
Yeah, in fairness, just gonna say, in fairness, there weren't cameras that could take great pictures of birds. There's no way of seeing what these birds look like until the past century. So
oh yeah,
we measure things differently now, and I certainly don't want people hunting birds like that now, but you know, times change. So
yeah, and we also didn't even have, I mean, even the binocular quality was not what it is now. But you know, but the fact is that specimen collecting, you know, just to remind everybody, specimen collecting nowadays is really highly regulated. It's even more regulated than hunting is. You know, there are a lot more permits allowed for hunting most species than there ever are for scientific collecting. And I could argue that, you know, scientific collecting at least ultimately will benefit the species a little bit more directly. Of course, hunting also helps generate revenues to benefit some species that are hunted in greater numbers. But scientific collecting is amazingly, extraordinarily regulated. You have no idea how many reports we have to prepare each year, for example, even just to collect a nest that was used during the field season or the breeding season by a bird, and then they're finished and they move on. Just to be able to salvage the nest requires an extensive amount of work on my part and Renee's part and other museum people's parts to keep those permits up. So it's they watch it quite a bit.
I have one Bond anecdote, and this is the only time that Bond went undercover that I know of. He was in probably Jamaica, and he had to get a permit to hunt certain doves, and the guy wouldn't give him permits. You know, he wasn't bribing him enough, whatever. And Bond could see the birds of the West Indies going down the drain if you can't write about the birds of Jamaica. So instead of arguing, he got on the boat and came back 3 months later wearing a loud shirt and a cheap camera and a brochure that said tourists could hunt doves in Jamaica. So instead of being an ornithologist, he was just Joe Schmo with a gun, and he walked right in and he could do all the hunting he wanted. So just shows you.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Very telling.
Yeah.
All right. Are there any other questions for Jim? Oh, Peggy, go ahead.
I have a sort of off-subject crazy question. I grew up also in the Philadelphia area and went to school in Western Philadelphia. And I'm sorry to say that my interest in birding didn't happen until much, much later. But I was very interested in the Beverly Hillbillies. And I'm wondering, in that picture that you have, it looks to me more like Granny than Miss Hathaway.
Absolutely. But I thought people were tired of seeing Miss Hathaway.
They were, but it looks like Granny rather than.
That was Miss Hathaway in disguise.
Oh, was it?
She was undercover that day.
Oh.
Miss Hathaway actually, her previous TV role, she actually also played a bird watcher in that role. So,
oh, really? Okay.
Little known fact, more than you need to know, but kind of followed her the rest of her life. But yes, next time I'll put Miss Hathaway in there with Mr. Drysdale.
I would like to say that, Peggy, you should be out recording data on birds and such, because that was an amazing observation. You can't even look back at the slide. So you had to catch that as it was going by. But it does explain why you're our librarian at the Western Foundation and have been doing that work for a very long time, because you are eagle-eyed. and you know your Beverly Hillbillies show.
One of the books that was recently turned in by somebody was that book of the birds of the Western Indies. So we have another copy of it.
Yeah, we have several copies. Let's see. Okay, are there any other questions? I'm looking for any other raised hands. I don't see any of the raised hands. Would anybody else like to just unmute themselves and ask?
I'd just like to thank everyone for coming. It was a lot of fun, and questions are always a little scary, but I think I survived. So
no, you did great, and that's so much fun. Paul, did you have a question though? You do have yourself unmuted.
No, actually, I was there was just something popped up in the chat that I was just going to share. You created such a nice conversation with us all, Mr. Wright, as if you came to visit us in our living room. Nicely done, and thank you. So, and I would, that isn't from me, but I would second that. It was really, yeah, very, very nice atmosphere about it. So a lot of fun. Thanks.
Yeah, I definitely had fun with you guys. So thanks for inviting me, and maybe I can come out and see you guys in person sometime. So thank you all.
It would be great. Yeah, we'd love to have you. And, you know, folks, we do have, the museum is open on a by appointment basis, but we do have a little exhibit about James Bond specimens, or we did for a long time, but we can put them back out now that Jim Wright has given this talk for us. We can put some of those back out, and we'll have the book, The Birds of the West Indies and such, so you can come and look at them. It's really very interesting. We don't have very many, you know, famous egg collectors that way.
And Jim, when you come, we have a lot of correspondence with James Bond in the 80s that he wrote to the museum asking for about bird data and all of that stuff. So you can look at the files and
excellent. Thank you. That's always fun.
Oh yeah, so we can scan that, you know, and share the data with you, share the correspondence with you.
Terrific.
Yeah, be good material for your book. All right, everybody. Well, listen, thank you so much for coming and for your comments and questions, and we hope you have a lovely weekend. And if you're going to go out trick-or-treating, have a great time. And I think Jim Wright will be wearing a giant woodpecker head, so you'll be able to recognize him if you're back in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania.
Linnea?
Yes.
Is it true this is recorded so somebody can pick it up?
Yes, we're going to be posting this. Oh, wait, the head has just appeared.
There is the head.
You do have a consistent costume available to you every Halloween, don't you?
Right on cue. Right on cue. That was beautiful.
Well done.
When I see a tree, I get sidetracked.
That's great. So we'll put the recording up on our website probably by the end of next week at the latest. We're probably going to trim off a little bit of it. We'll clean it up a little, but we'll have it up there as soon as we can. Okay, but it's lovely seeing all of you.
Great.
Thank you, Jim, very much.
Take care. Thank you.
Yeah.
In case folks didn't notice, somebody also put the link to his Smithsonian article in the chat. I've got it copied, and we can just send it out in an email to participants as well. So we've got that along with the recording.
Mention my website again too, realjamesbond.net.
Oh,
That's
yeah,
a lot of fun as well.
Please, yeah, and his book is wonderful. His book is wonderful and entertaining, and it has great photographs. It's really, really nice. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Good night.
Good times. That was good times. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks.
Bye.